Your pressure-treated wood dies in 15 years. Their beams are still solid after 700. What did they know that we don't? Your fence posts go soft right where they touch the ground. Your deck boards warp, crack, and turn to sponge within a decade, even though they're stamped treated. Your garden shed door swells shut when it rains and shrinks into gaps when the sun comes out. You repaint. You restain. You buy more weatherproof products, and every few years, you start over. Now imagine a different story. A timber beam is cut, lifted into place, and left to face rain, snow, frost, insects, and sun. It holds up a roof or a floor year after year, while generations of people live and die underneath. 500 winters pass. 700. The roof might be reslated. The plaster might be replaced. But when restorers open up the frame, they find the original beam still there, darkened and worn on the outside, but solid within, strong enough to keep working. That's not fantasy. That's what keeps happening when people open up certain medieval churches, barns, bridges, and harbor structures. Long before modern chemistry, builders were producing wood that, in real-world conditions, has outperformed many of our industrial preservatives. The phrase "stronger than modern chemicals" doesn't mean a single medieval potion beats every lab-engineered product in every test tube. It means this: over centuries of exposure in the real world, their method has delivered durability that our disposable construction culture rarely even tries to match. So what was this method? It wasn't one trick. It was a chain of decisions that started in the forest and ended in the way a beam met stone and rain. Taken together, those decisions created a preservation system that transformed wood from a fragile wet plant into something closer to long-term infrastructure. The first secret: they started preserving wood before the tree fell. To most people today, a tree is wood on a stick. To medieval carpenters, it was already a complex engineering material. They noticed that not all trees behaved the same when cut. Some logs twisted and split, others stayed true. Some beams rotted quickly, others stubbornly endured. They learned to see patterns. Trees cut in the wrong season misbehaved. If you felled in spring or early summer, the wood was full of rising sap, water, sugars, minerals, all the stuff fungi love. Cut in winter, when the sap dropped and growth paused, the wood started life drier and leaner. That meant fewer nutrients for decay and a head start on seasoning. They paid attention to where a tree grew. Timber from slow-grown trees on poorer soil with tight rings showed better stability and strength than fast. Fat growth from rich valleys. Dense heartwood from older trees resisted insects and fungi naturally better than pale outer sapwood. Over time, these observations hardened into rules. Fell in the right season. Favor heartwood. Favor slow growth. Avoid twisted grain. The second secret: they respected grain instead of shredding it. Today, logs are fed through high-speed saws for maximum yield. Boards are sliced across rings at whatever angle gives the most product. Inside each plank, fibers can run straight, diagonal, or surface, and dive back in. That kind of runout creates easy paths for water and rot to move, and concentrates stress where cracks love to start. Medieval sawyers took a slower path. They split first. They rived logs with wedges, following the natural planes inside the wood. A log would be split into halves, then quarters, then eighths, each split running along continuous fibers from end to end. From those straight-grained wedges, they laid out beams, planks, posts, and braces, so each piece carried intact fibers, not chopped ones. When they did saw, often by hand with a pit saw, They tried to align cuts with the grain they saw in the split faces, and they chased certain ring orientations. Boards cut so that growth rings were more vertical tended to stay flatter, swell more evenly, and check less. Timbers hewn from riven stock had long, unbroken fibers that resisted bending and moisture intrusion. This isn't romantic, it's structural science. A piece of wood with continuous fibers behaves like a bundle of parallel ropes. One with runout behaves like ropes with lots of short, cut ends sticking out through its skin. When water hits both, which one will channel moisture deep inside more easily? When fungi land, which one offers more damaged entry points? By aligning with grain, medieval carpenters created timber that wanted to stay whole. That's preservation step 2. Make the substrate itself less eager to fail. The third secret: they let time and air do the invisible work. Fresh wood is heavy with water. If you lock it into a building or drown it in a hard coating, that moisture doesn't just vanish. It moves slowly. Uneven drying tears fibers apart, opens cracks, and creates pockets where water gets trapped. Medieval carpenters avoided rushing this. They seasoned wood under cover, open sheds, barn lofts, airing racks. Logs might be rough squared, then stacked off the ground with spacers between each layer. Air could circulate freely around all faces. Sun was largely kept off to prevent surface case hardening and checking. It was boring, slow work. But slowly, moisture content fell. Internal stresses bled off gradually instead of explosively. In some regions and trades, they even used water as part of this pre-treatment. Logs stored in ponds, rivers, or tidal basins for months or years had their sugars leached and pores flooded. Underwater, with little oxygen, decay barely advanced. When those logs were finally raised and then air-dried under control, they ended up denser, less nutrient-rich, and more resistant to fungi and insects. By the time a seasoned beam reached a frame, it was no longer raw, plant tissue. It was a stabilized, pre-shrunk structural element. That's preservation step 3. Remove the easiest food and water for rot, in advance, using nothing but patience, air, and sometimes clean water. Now the method turns from invisible to dramatic. Fire. At first glance, burning wood to preserve it sounds insane. But medieval craftsmen, like their counterparts in other cultures, noticed something counterintuitive. Wood near hearths and smoke vents aged differently. Smoke-blackened rafters in soot-filled halls stayed strangely solid. Beams closest to the constant, low-grade heat of cooking fires didn't rot as expected. Later, intentional charring became a deliberate tool. Take a dry beam or post. Hold it over a small, hot fire or against a bed of coals. Turn it slowly, just until the outer surface turns uniformly black and starts to crackle. Then stop. You haven't burned away the wood's strength. You've transformed a few millimeters of its skin into carbon. That char layer is chemically and physically different from raw wood. It's less appetizing to insects and fungi. Its micropores don't wick water the same way. Liquid tends to bead and run instead of pulling in deep. It also provides a roughened, high surface area shell, perfect for holding the next ingredients. Medieval carpenters used this burnt shell on posts destined for soil, on lower cladding boards, on exterior timbers, and in some marine contexts. It was messy, smoky work, and it could be dangerous if done carelessly. But handled well, it created a sacrificial armor. The char itself could slowly erode under sun and rain, while the intact wood beneath stayed protected. On its own, char slows decay. Combined with the next piece of the method, it becomes something far more potent. The fourth secret: They fed the char with living tree chemistry. If you heat resinous wood, pine stumps, roots, knots, in low oxygen, it sweats. Thick, aromatic liquid oozes out. Wood tar, pine tar, birch tar, and similar distillates have been used across cultures as waterproofers, adhesives, and preservatives. Medieval and early modern Europe used enormous quantities of pine tar on ships, roofs, tools, and structural timbers. Warm pine tar brushed onto bare wood does a decent job on its own. It penetrates, soaks into pores, and leaves a flexible, water-shedding film. But when you apply it to charred wood that has just been heated, something better happens. The char's pores act like a sponge. The heat thins the tar. It runs in deeper, saturating not just the outer surface, but several layers down. Artisans figured out that heating the tar before applying it was critical. The hotter, within safe limits, the more deeply it ran, especially into the freshly charred shell. Once cooled, you have a composite skin, carbonized fibers locked full of resins and phenolic compounds from the tar, chemically hostile to many forms of decay and physically reluctant to move water. They didn't stop at pure tar. They had a whole chemical toolkit from the forest and field. Drying oils like linseed from flax seeds could be mixed with tar to thin it and help it penetrate, then polymerize inside the wood. Nut oils, walnut, for example, added their own characteristics. Resinous varnishes from tree saps could be blended to adjust flexibility and gloss. Beeswax could be melted in small amounts to tweak hardness and water behavior. These weren't random brews. Craftsmen noticed which mixtures stayed tacky, which hardened too brittle, which held up in salt spray, and which worked best in interiors. They adapted blends to the job. Thick, smoky tar for hulls and foundations, tar oil mixes for posts, sills, and cladding, oil wax finishes for furniture and interior joinery. From a modern perspective, the science is clear. Tar brings biocides and hydrophobicity. Oil brings deep penetration and internal polymerization. Wax and resins add surface water shedding and abrasion resistance. Combined, especially over char, they form a multi-level defense. A charred, resin-rich outer crust, a tar, oil-saturated zone beneath, and a stabilized, seasoned core. Compare that with many modern treatments that work like thin raincoats. A hard shell, maybe a few hundred microns thick, often sitting on wood that was never really stabilized. Once that shell cracks, water gets behind it. And because the film is less permeable than the wood, moisture gets trapped. Rot begins in the dark, and by the time you see peeling, the damage inside is advanced. The medieval method is closer to soaking leather in oil than wrapping it in plastic. It turns part of the wood itself into a different material, still wood, but chemically tougher, less tasty, and less thirsty. The fifth secret, their chemistry, was backed by physics and geometry. Even the best treatment fails if water is allowed to sit in joints or suck endlessly into end grain. Medieval builders attacked that problem not with more goo, but with design. They used generous roof overhangs, drip edges, and moldings to shed water away from walls. They lifted beams and posts off bare soil with stone plinths and foundation walls, interrupting capillary rise from the ground. Where wood did meet masonry, they sometimes added lead or stone caps, or at least shaped the contact so water couldn't sit and soak. End grain, the open tubes at the ends of boards and beams, was rarely left naked to the rain. It was either hidden inside joints, protected under overhangs, or heavily treated. In some places, caps or sacrificial blocks were added at vulnerable ends that could be replaced when they eventually failed. Joints themselves were designed to squeeze water out, not hold it. Tight mortise and tenon connections with drawboard pegs stayed under constant compression. As timbers swelled and shrank over seasons, that locked contact made it harder for water to pump in and out with every humidity change. On ships, plank seams were V-shaped and packed with caulking. Swelling timber compressed the fibers and tar, creating self-tightening seals. They accepted that some water would always get in and gave it quick escape routes. Roof structures were ventilated. Loft floors were slatted. Hull interiors had limbers, channels, and bilge spaces. Drains, scuppers, and runnels directed water away. In that context, a tarred, charred surface doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to delay water long enough that when it does sneak behind, airflow and drainage remove it before fungi and insects really get moving. The sixth secret: smoke and heat as slow preservatives. In many early buildings, especially before chimneys, smoke from central hearths filled the upper space before filtering out through vents. Rafters, purlins, and roof boards lived for years in a low-oxygen, warm, smoky environment. Over time, smoke compounds accumulated in the wood, adding mild antiseptic and hydrophobic effects. The constant gentle heat also kept moisture levels lower, cycling off damp. People at the time noticed smoky buildings had blackened rafters, but those rafters often refused to rot. Even when chimneys came into use, some practices persisted: curing timbers by hanging them where heat and smoke rose, drying them further, and loading them with smoke chemistry before installation. This wasn't a standalone preservative technique, but it stacked with everything else. Smoke-cured, seasoned, charred, and tarred wood is a very different starting point for decay than a green, flat-sawn, paint-covered board. The seventh secret: they built maintenance into the system, not as an afterthought. Here's where the comparison to modern chemicals becomes sharp. Many industrial coatings are marketed as one and done. Apply and forget. In reality, they degrade, chalk, embrittle, and peel. But the story we're sold encourages neglect until failure. Medieval finishes assumed reapplication. Tar on a hull? You expected to retar periodically. Oil wax on a door? You rubbed more on as it dried out or wear appeared. Because the underlying material was already strong and well prepared, these maintenance coats weren't desperately fighting active rot. They were topping up a system that was already biased toward survival. In the long term, that's a more robust strategy. Instead of betting everything on a single, perfect barrier that inevitably fails and traps moisture, you accept wear and design for renewal. Each added tar or oil coat reaches a little further into sun-weathered fibers, keeping the preserved zone thick and continuous. So is this really stronger than modern chemicals? In a lab, with carefully controlled conditions, many modern preservatives will show higher resistance to specific fungi or insects than tar and oil on small samples. But out in the weather, our shortcuts catch up with us. We use young, fast-grown sapwood with wild grain. We rush drying. We expose end grain and create water-trapping joints. Then we ask thin surface films and pressure-infused salts to save the day. Medieval builders did the opposite. They gave themselves the best substrate they could, altered it with time, heat, water, and fire, soaked it in natural chemistry that penetrated deeply, and then arranged structures so water had the hardest possible path and an easy exit. That's why, centuries later, we still find tar traces and intact cells in beams that have stood through storms, and neglect that would have destroyed most treated decks several generations ago. For a curious, practical, analytical, slightly nostalgic viewer, the obvious question is, what can be taken from this lost method today? You probably aren't going to soak logs in ponds for years or set up a tar kiln in your backyard. But pieces of the system are absolutely available. Choose better wood where it matters. Heartwood of more durable species for posts, sills, and exposed structural members. Respect grain. When you can, use riven or at least straight-grained stock and orient boards. So growth rings are closer to vertical. Dry, slow, and smart. Store wood under cover, off the ground, with airflow on all sides before it faces weather. Use controlled char. For ground contact and high exposure parts, char the surface carefully instead of leaving it raw. Use penetrating natural finishes, real pine tar, drying oils, and oil wax mixes that soak into the wood instead of sitting as a brittle shell. Design for water: big overhangs, drip edges, stone bases, protected end grain, joints that compress rather than gape, and clear drainage. Plan for maintenance. Assume you'll recoat over the years and choose finishes that are easy to renew, not hard shells that must be stripped. None of those steps require mysticism. They require the same thing medieval carpenters had: patience, observation, and a willingness to accept that a beam or board is a long-term relationship, not a disposable commodity. The lost wood preservation method stronger than modern chemicals isn't a single secret ingredient. It's a worldview. Treat wood as a partner, not a problem. Start preserving at the tree, not at the paint can. Stack small, natural advantages until rot and insects have to work 10 times harder to get a foothold. When you walk into a centuries-old timber building and run your hand over a dark, smooth beam that has seen more winters than any synthetic coating ever will, you're touching the outcome of that worldview. And if you decide to borrow even a piece of it for your next project, you're taking one quiet step back toward a time when builders assumed their work should last longer than they would.